Today's daf is daf Yud Beis, and we'll start with the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Beis. And the subject for today is Pigul in Menachos. A lot of what we learned in Zvachim with regard to Pigul will be relevant here as well. And the Mishnah establishes that Hakometz es hamincha lechol shireha bachutz. So we have a case here of a kavonas chutz, and that's called chutzlim komo. And let's just review that there's a fundamental difference between chutz lizmano and chutzlim komo. Chutz lizmano creates pigul with an iser kares. If you eat the pigul, you get kares. Whereas chutzlim komo passels the carbon, but it doesn't generate a full-fledged shem pigul for kares. Now, in the case of Menachos, the main focus right now is on the kmitza, so that the kmitza becomes the primary avoda of a mincha, and his intention at the moment of kmitza is going to determine pigul. And now he has an intention of chutzlim komo, meaning after the kmitza we have what's called shirayim. The shirayim of the mincha after the kmitza will be eaten by the kohen in the azara, and only for that night, meaning the day of the mincha and the night following. So we could have chutzim komo if he has in mind that the shirayim would be eaten outside the azara. That's called chutzim komo, which, as we said, would passel the carbon but not generate a chiyuv kares and a full-fledged shem pigul. Now the Mishnah goes on to tell me, O kizayis mishireh bachutz, it doesn't have to be a machshava of eating the entire shirayim, all of the shirayim bachutz. It's enough if he has in mind that he'll eat only a kizayis worth, because in kol kula kizayis is called an achila, and he has in mind that a kizayis of the shirayim would be eaten outside the azara. Now let's keep in mind that it's not enough for the kometz, I should say the kmitza, to be matir shirayim. You also have to wait for the haktorah. So the kometz after the kmitza will be brought to the mizbeach, and there it will be burnt, and then and only then can the kohanim eat the shirayim, whatever left of the mincha after the kmitza. Now the Mishnah goes on and says that we can establish pigul also at the time of the haktorah. How so? Lahaktir kumtza bachutz. If he has in mind, let's say at the moment that he does the kmitza, the kohen has in mind that the kometz itself, which has to be burnt on the mizbeach, should be burnt outside of the azara. And again, it always, fascinates our minds why a kohen would do such a thing when the avodah has to be done in the azara. The mizbeach is in the azara. The burning, quite obviously, of the kometz has to be in the azara, but he has in mind to burn it outside the azara, and that also will create pigul, but again, not the full-fledged pigul, because we're talking about chutzim komo, o kizayis kumtza bachutz, or he had in mind that not the entire shirayim would be burnt bachutz, but only a kizayis will be burnt bachutz. That's enough, says the Mishnah, to generate a machshavas pigul. Now, keep in mind, I'm just saying this by introduction to today's daf, that although the Mishnah continuously and consistently mentions kizayis, Rabbi Chia, who lived at the time of the Tanoim, will bring a different text of the Mishnah. And Rav is going to quote Rabbi Chia's text of the Mishnah in this sugya on Daf Yud Beis, according to which the Kizayis is omitted. And then we're going to have a lot of work to do to figure out why Rabbi Chia omitted Kizayis. Let me go on. Olahakte levonasa bachutz. Now let's keep in mind that in every mincha, except for a minchas chote and a minchas knos, but generally across the board in mincha, we have not just the komets of the flour, we also have the komets of the levona that the Torah commands to add to the flour, and that levona has to be burnt on the mizbeach, and he had in mind to burn the levona outside of the azara. That also will create pigul, and again, not a full-fledged pigul, but now we turn to the end of the daf, and the end of daf Yud Alf and Beis establishes in the name of the Mishnah that posel v'yein bo kares. And now we're going to talk about chutz lizmano. Until now, the Mishnah is talking about chutz l'mkomo outside the azara, and it's pigul without kares. The pigul here only passes the korban, but if somebody eats that korban, he does not incur a chi of kares. However, lechol shireho lemachar, if he has a machshavas chutz lizmano, that's a full-fledged machshavas pigul, and now he has in mind that the shirayim should be eaten tomorrow, and the shirayim could only be eaten today and the night following the day. Oh, and the Mishnah again wants to establish that the minimum achila in his machshavas pigul was a kezayis, or kezayis mishirel lemachar. Or now we go on to haktorah, right? He has in mind that the haktoras hakomets, right after the kmitza, the komets has to be burnt on the mizbech. He has in mind that it should be burnt lemachar, and that's called chutz lizmano. Okazayis mikum tzelamocher. Again, the Mishnah is very consistent in its symmetrical structure, that these halachos apply even to a kazayis. So the komets, which has to be burnt on the mizbeach, he has in mind to burn the komets tomorrow after the zman of the korban has elapsed, which is a machshava of chutz lizmano that creates full-fledged pigul. And now we start today's daf, and the Mishnah says, pigul v'chayavin oleh kares, because now we're talking about chutz lizmano. We're not talking about outside of the azara, but rather out tomorrow. Zaklal kol hakomets. Okay, now the Mishnah is going to point out that these machshavos that passel the korban, and even in the case of chutz lizmano generate a chiv kares and pigul, they apply to 4 different avodos. Just as in Zvachim we have 4 avodos, so in Mincha we have 4 avodos. Kol hakomets, the first avoda is the kmitza. Then number 2, he's got nosein bekli. Okay, then he has to be makadesh the komets a second time by putting it in a kli shares. And it could be that the Kohen who did the kmitza put it into a kli, or it could be somebody else another Kohen put it into a kli. And then there's the molech. Now we have to take the komets to the mizbeach, and there's a molech who is a Kohen's job to bring the komets in the kli over to the mizbeach, and then we have the maktir. Then we have possibly another Kohen who takes the kli that has the komets in it and puts it on the fire on the mizbeach. Okay, now in all these 4 avodos, the Kohen in any of the 4 avodos had a machshava of either chutz lizmano, let's start, chutz l'mkomo or chutz lizmano, and the shirayim should be eaten if it's a davar shedarko lechol. So we have to see exactly what the Mishnah is excluding here. But if you have something that is completely out of the picture of achila, then the machshava of achila chutzes manu chutzim komo does not register. Or lahaktir, if he has in mind that the haktor of the komet should be either chutzes manu chutzim komo, it's got to be dover shedarko lahaktir. Now keep in mind that the word achila here is used in what parallels achila is haktorah, meaning, as we've said more than once, there's two achilos. There's achila of the Kohen, and then there's the achila of the Mizbeach. So that's called haktorah. And just like in the achilas Adam, the machshava only registers to generate pigul if it was on a davar shedarko lechol, so too in the machshava of achilas Mizbeach, which is called haktorah, it's got to be a machshava to be makter a davar shedarko lahaktir. Now, I'm just looking here if he gives you an example. Just one second, maybe he would illustrate this. No, I don't see that he right now gives an example. So we'll have to flesh this out. Okay, now we have chutzim komo posove bokores, chutzis manu pigol v'chayoven aleo kores. Okay, so these four words in the Mishnah refer to a parallel sugya of matir with regard to zvachim. And what it means is the machshava of chutzes manu chutzim komo in a certain avoda would only generate pigul if all the other avodos, right, the three remaining avodos, were done perfectly as a matir. So we have a matir, but if let's say in the first avoda he would have machshava of chutzes manu chutzim komo, and then he would have a machshava poselos in the second avoda, then the machshava of chutzes manu chutzim komo in the first avoda would not generate pigul, because the principle is ad sheyakriv hamatir kimitzvaso, meaning that one particular avoda was done improperly, but all the other three avodos were done properly. Ketzad, right? So the Mishnah is now going to elaborate on this last principle of matir ad sheyakriv hamatir kimitzvaso. Karvan kamatz b'shtika. So now the kmitza, which is the beginning of the process of the avodah of the mincha, was done without any intention whatsoever. I called it a jughead, if you remember. Right? He has nothing in his mind. But then, nasan bekli v'holech v'hiktir chutz lizmano. Then in one of the subsequent three avodos, whether it be the nesina into the kli, whether it be the holochas hakli, or whether it be the haktor al gabi ha'esh, he had a machshov of chutzes mano. So in that case, the machshava would generate pigul. Why? Because it wasn't that he started with a negative, invalid machshava at the time of the shechita. At the time of the shechita, he had no machshava whatsoever. So now we look at the other avodos, and if during one of the other three avodos he has a machshava poseles, if it's chutzes mano chutzim komo, it creates pigul. Oshe komatz chutzes mano. Oh, now we have a case where he did the kmitza chutzes mano. Now, if that kmitza is going to generate pigul because the machshavas chutzes mano, that would depend upon the fact that all the subsequent three avodas were done properly. And therefore the Mishnah goes on to say, Nosam bekli v'holef v'hikter v'shtika, he did not have any sort of negative machshava poseles in any of the remaining three avodos, then his machshava in kmitza of chutzes mano is going to generate pigul. Oh, the Mishnah continues, Shekamatz v'nosam bekli v'holef v'hikter chutzes mano. So again, the first three avodos were performed with the correct and proper machshava, but then the haktorah, when he got to the last of the four avodos, he had in mind that it should be chutzes mano chutzim komo. Zeu, all the cases that we mentioned are korev hamater k'mitzvasa, meaning that only one of the four avodos had a machshava posels, the other three had the right proper machshava. Ketza, what would be a case of lo korev hamater k'mitzvasa? Would be the following: komatz chutzim komo. In other words, his machshava during the kmitza was chutzim komo. And then when he got to the next avoda, nasam bekli, or alternatively holich, or alternatively hiktir, he had in mind chutz's mano. Now again, he started the machshav of chutzim komo, and then he messed up again with the machshav of chutz's mano. So there's no korev hamater kimitzvaso, because now in two avodos he had a machshava poselis. And in order to generate pigul, we need that one of the avodos was done with a machshava poselis, whereas the remaining three in either direction were a machshava kshera. Another example of lo karav hamatik mitzvah. So oshe kamatz chutzuz mano, right? He started with already on the left leg in his first avoda of kmitza, and he added my chutzuz mano, and then nasan bekli v'holech v'hiktir chutzim komo. Right, so this is basically the same case that we had before, but just we're switching it around. With the Lizmano came first, or the Chutzizmano came first, or the Chutzim Koma came first. But it's the same exact principle that when he got to the subsequent avodos of either Nesina Bekli, Holacha, or Aktora, he again had a machshava poseles. Bad enough that he started with a machshava poseles, but he had a machshava of Chutzim Komo. So again, in all these cases, the carbon will certainly be possible because all his machshavos from beginning to end, from A to Z, were all psulos, but there's no pigul, because for pigul we have the condition of achayatir hamakriv kimitzvaso. Next, another case of lo karev hamatik kimitzvaso shekomatz nasam bekli v'holaf v'hiktir chutzim komo. Right? Let's say, for example, when he did the kmitza, or when he did the nesina of the kometz into a kli shares, or when he was molech, he brought the kli over to the mizbech, or he did the aktorah, and he had in mind of chutz limkomo, right? For example, any of these four avodos that we mentioned, he had in mind that it should be eaten, the shiraim should be eaten outside of the Azara. And then any of the other three avodas, he had in mind a machshavas pigel of chutz's mano for the achil of tomorrow. Zeu lo karev hamata kimitzvasa. Okay. Now, in all cases of a machshava poseles in Menachos, then even if the mincha is psula, but it's ola lebailim l'shem chova, not so. I'm sorry. Let me say it again. In all machshava poselos, even if lo ola lebailim l'shem chova, and he's going to have to replace it with another mincha, but we're going to go through the avodos. But there are two exceptions. Minchas chote and minchas knos. In those cases, the machshava poselos completely passes the korban. Just bring it out to the Beis Hapsul and burn it. You know, we're not going to go through the avodos, and for sure it's not ola l'bayil m'shem chova. So therefore, kamtzon shalo lishman, if the kohen at the time of the kmitza had in mind shalo lishman, so this is a machshava shalo lishma. Until now, the Mishnah has been addressing two machshavos, either chutzim mano or chutzim komo. Chutzim komo meaning outside the Azara, chutzim mano outside of tonight and today and tonight. But now we're talking about a machshava of shalo lishma. For example, let's say it in mind that he was doing it for a karban other than mincha. So in such a case, in these two menachos, a machshava of shalo lishma completely passes the carbon, meaning that not only is it Eino Ola L'Shem Bailim L'Shem Chova, but in addition, it's much more fundamental. We just throw out the carbon. It's completely invalid. Nosam Bekliva Holof Hiktir Chutzes Mano, or Shekamatz Chutzes Mano, and Nosam Bekliva Holof Vehiktir Shalol Lishmon, Shekamatz V'Nosam Kliva Holof Vehiktir Shalol Lishmon, Zeu Shalokarov Mater Kimitzvos. So again, now the Mishnah goes on to address a machshavas pigul of either chutzes man or chutzes komo, which again, as we know, is much more severe and profound than shalol lishma. And the Mishnah goes through various scenarios where there will be no pigul. And why is there no pigul? Because let's take the first case as one example. Nosam bekliva holofehiktir chutzes mano. Right? That in any of these avodos, he had a machshav of chutzes mano. But not only in one of the machshavos, but in all of the machshavos, or alternatively, if the kmitza was shalol lishma. So we should read the Mishnah when it says lo karv hamater kimitzvoso as a hemshech, as a continuation of the opening line of this section of the Mishnah, kamtzon shalol lishma. And we said that in these two menachos, right, knos or chote, the machshava shalol lishma passes the carbon. Once the carbon is passel, even if he would do the remaining three avodos for chutzes man or chutzim koma, it would not generate pigul because it's not hikriv hamater k'mitzvaso. Because karamatel k'mitzvaso means that all the other avodos were done bekashrus once the kmitza at the beginning, at the anfang, how do you say, the beginning of the avoda was shalol lishma. In these two menachos, the carbon is absolutely possible. And therefore, you can't tell me that a machshavas chutzes mano chutzim komo is going to generate pigul. Then the Mishnah gives another example where the kmitza was chutzes mano, but then any of the other avodos was shalol lishma. If any of the other avodos in these two menachos are shalol lishma, that passes the carbon. So even if the kmitza was done with a machshava ha-mefageles, it would not generate pigul because it's not karv hamatik vitzvasa. Or let's say, for example, oshe kamatz v'nosan bekli v'holich v'hiktir shalol lishman. So let's say he did the kmitza, and then the second avoda was the nesinas kli, and then the third avoda was holacha. And in all these cases, he had a machshav of shalol lishman. Then in these two karbonos, as we said over and over again, they passel the carbon, and therefore there's no room for any machshava hamafagelis. Now, the Mishnah continues with a very particular case of lechol kezayis bachutz or kezayis lemocher. In other words, at the time that he did one of the avodos, he had two machshava poselis. Again, it's one avoda, but a double machshava poselis. For example, he had in mind in any of the four avodos, lechol kezayis bachutz and kezayis lemocher. So he's got a machshava of chutz limkomo and a machshava of chutz lizmano. Or flip it around the other way, kezayis lemochar, which is a machshava of chutz lizmano, and kezayis bachutz. Now we go a step further. Again, in all these cases, the Mishnah wants to establish that even though he has a machshava ha-mefageles of chutz lizmano, right, lemochar, but he also at the same time had a machshava of chutz limkomo of lechel kezayis bachutz. So how do we treat this? Well, let's look at the first machshava. The first machshava was a machshava of chutz limkomo, right? Lechol kizayis b'chutz. In the next case, kizayis l'mochar, his first initial machshava, again, this is all verbal, he has to verbalize it, was chutz lizmano, l'mochar. So in these cases, it doesn't matter one iota which machshava came first, but since he has another machshava of chutzim komo, for example, in the first case, he started with a machshava of chutzim komo. In the second case, he ended with a machshava of chutzim komo, but he definitely had a machshava of chutzim komo. And once he has a machshava of chutzim komo, that undermines the status of pigul, because pigul is only on chutzim mano. He did have a machshava of chutzim mano on a kazayis. But nevertheless, he also added in that same avoda a machshava of chutzim komo. Once he adds the machshava of chutzim komo, it downgrades the level of pigul from a full-fledged pigul with a chiyuv kares to a psul without a chiyuv kares. So I'm just going to skip for a second a few words, and the Mishnah will come right back to it. And the bottom line in this whole section of the Mishnah is posel v'yein kares. What did we skip? Kechatzi zayis b'chutz, kechatzi zayis l'mochar, k'zayis chayim l'mochar, k'zayis chutz l'chutz. Let's say he had a double machshava in one particular avoda of both chutzim komo, chutzim mano, but he had a machshava on a half a zayis. Again, it doesn't matter whether the half a zayis is the shirayim for the achilas kohen, or whether it's the chatzi zayis of the haktor al gabi mizbech of the kometz itself. That's irrelevant. The two achilos adam or achilos mizbech. But he only had a machshava on a chatzi zayis. We're going to integrate his machshava on a chatzi zayis of chutzim mano or chutzim komo with the other machshava of chutzim mano, chutzim komo of a chatzi zayis, and it's going to pass the korban. Comes along, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the sequence is very critical. Rabbi Yehuda zaklal. If he started with a machshava of chutzim mano, which generates a full-fledged chiyuv kares and pigul, and then he went ahead and he had another machshava afterwards of chutzim komo, and it then says Rabbi Yehuda, it becomes pigul v'chayav and kares, meaning the second machshava of chutzim komo cannot undermine the chalos pigul that was generated by the machshava of chutz lizmano. However, if he went in the opposite direction and he started with a machshava of chutz limkomo, and then kodma, meaning he came first, and then he had a machshava of chutz lizmano, then posel v'embo kares, meaning Rabbi Yehuda's principle is halach achar, or it's called the Gemara's language tfos lashon rishon. What was his first statement? If his first statement was chutzim mano, that generates and establishes a chiyuv kares with pigul, full-fledged pigul, and that can't be removed by a subsequent machshava. If he started with the machshava of chutzim koma, that passes the korban, it doesn't create a chiyuv kares at a full-fledged pigul, and therefore when he has a subsequent machshava of chutz mano, that machshava of chutzim mano can no longer impact and create pigul because he already started with a machshava chutzim koma. The Chacham Omrim, no, there's no kares. Even in the case where he started with a chutz mano, and that original first machshava would create pigul. No, when he subsequently has a machshava in the avoda that it should be chutz komo, then it's not considered ache korev hamater kimitzvaso, and therefore there's no kares. So whereas Rabbi Yehuda sort of disqualifies the second machshava, the Rabbanan say no, the second machshava registers, and it will impact to undermine the chiyuv kares, and therefore it's possible, but without a chiyuv kares. Gemara. Okay, so now we got through the easy part of the daf. Now we get to the hard part. Now, just by introduction, this sugya is mostly about Abaye and Rava. They are the main persona on the stage, but they're all arguing about Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia was a late Tana at the end of the period of the Tanoim, and Rabbi Chia very often had a different text of the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi than what we have. And that's going to be our sugya. Okay, first the Gemara starts with a suffix, iboilahu. Now, to appreciate this iboilahu, we have to go back to the halacha of chaser. You remember that we had discussions in the past that a mincha has to be shlema. It has to be complete. If part of the mincha is lost, again, it depends on what time, but let's say, for example, he did the kmitza and there wasn't a full-fledged shear, the minimal amount of the mincha itself at the time of the kmitza, then it's possible. And we had various drashas, and we derived from them that it has to be sholem and so forth and so on. Now, lidivya omer shirayim shechasru. Right, we're not talking about a chisaron at the time of the kmitza, but rather after the kmitza, we need to take the komets and bring it onto the mazbech and be makter it. And now what happened is that the haktorah, which is meant to be matir the shirayim, and the shirayim became chaser. Again, it wasn't chaser at the time of the kmitza. Excuse me, I got something caught in my throat. If the shirayim were chaser at the time of the kmitza, the whole enterprise is invalid. Everything's possible. But at the time of the kmitza, it was sholem. It was complete. Now we're up to the stage of haktorah. But before the haktorah, after the kmitza, there was a chisaron, such that now the haktorah could not be matir the entire shirayim because part of the shirayim is gone. And on this we have a controversy between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. I'm trying to remember what daf it was on. Oh, it's back on daf Tes. Okay. And Rabbi Yochanan says that since you have something left to the shirayim, that's enough to justify the haktorah of the komets, which will now be effective to be matir whatever remnants you have of the shirayim. L'divrei Omer, this is Rabbi Yochanan, that shirayim shechasu ben kmitza haktorah. So once again, I emphasize for the third time that at the time of the kmitza it was sholem. It became chaser after the kmitza, but at the time of the haktorah it's already chaser. Is maktir komets aleah. Okay. He can go ahead and do the haktorah because there's still shirayim left over, some remnants of the shirayim. However, and here it gets really complicated, even though he's going to be maktir the komets, in this case, the komets does not have the power to be matir the shirayim because the shirayim are chaser. That's Rabbi Yochanan's shita. B'kaimelon, and we accept Rabbi Yochanan's shita. The osan shirayim asur b'achila. So there's a very weird kind of scenario here where the haktorah of the komets is not matir the shirayim b'achila, even though we're going ahead with the haktorah. And the reason for that is because since the shirayim are chaser, they don't lend themselves to receive a matir from the haktorah of the komets. And now the Gemara wants to know, mahu ditahani lahu haktorah, if the haktorah is implemented without the power to be matir shirayim, what does that haktorah accomplish? As we say in Yiddish, tu'oif. What is it, tu'oif? It's got to affect something. So Gemara wants to suggest that it affects something negative, lemikve'inu bepigel. That now the machshava could be a machshavas pigel that would, let's say, he has a machshava. Let's say, I don't know if he gives an example here. Oh, maybe he gives an example. The Kohen did the Torah with the intention. Very interesting. The Kohen had a machshava to do the achila. He did the Torah. No. Just 1 second. Yeah, I was right. He did the Torah with the machshava to eat the shirayim, chutzes mano chutzim komo, when you can't even eat the shirayim. Because we said that according to Rabbi Yochanan, even though we could be maktir the komets, we can't be maktir the shirayim. We can't allow the kohen to eat the shirayim. But nevertheless, the machshava of chutzes mano chutzim komo at the time of the Torah for the shirayim, according to one side in the Gemara suffix, will generate pigul. And not only that, the Torah will have another uftu, and lafkeinu midei meila. The Torah always removes the isa meila. But why does the Torah remove the isa meila? The Torah removes the isa meila because there's no meila on something that's given to the Kohen for achila. And since the Torah now is mata the shirayim, and the Kohanim are going to now eat the shirayim of the kmitza, of the komets, therefore there's no isa meila. Like, for example, in shlomim, right? There's no meila in shlomim because it's eaten by the violent. But here in this case, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you can't eat the shirayim. The Kohanim are enjoined from eating the shirayim. So therefore, you and I would have said intuitively that the haktorah of the komets could not be mafkia meila. It can't be mafkia meila if it's not matir the shirayim. La'achila. Right? The heter achila is what removes meila. But here there's no heter achila. But the Gemara still insists that since Rabbi Yochanan pushes forward the agenda that you are maktir the shirayim, then X, Y, and Z of the Haktorah will apply, but what won't apply is to be maktir the achila of the shirayim. So what's the X, Y, and Z? It's going to be a machshava of chutzes mano, chutzim komo. Let's focus on chutzes mano that would generate pigul, and a hafkah of the isa meila. Omer Rav Huna, afilu Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so now we're going to get into the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rava, and then Abai is going to attack Rava. Rav Huna says, okay, so now we get to a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. We'll start with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds Zrika mo'eles liyotze. What happens? A carbon that's taken out of the Azara becomes possible. It's totally invalid because of Yotze. Yotze means it was taken out of the Azara. Now, you and I would have said intuitively, which is going to be Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, that once there's a psul of Yotze, then Zrika of the carbon is completely meaningless because the carbon is possible. Comes along Rabbi Akiva with a very unique revolutionary shita, and he holds that Zrika mo'eles liyotze. What does it mean, Zrika mo'eles liyotze? So I'm going to take Rav Huna's approach to Rabbi Akiva. You'll see later on a different approach. And that is that according to Rabbi Akiva, since the carbon still exists, meaning it's yotze, but it's be'en, it's still there, it hasn't been lost or burnt. So the zrika itself is now going to take place, and that's going to be the shita of Rabbi Akiva. Comes along Rav Huna, he says, Hani mili yotze de isa b'yene, right? The carbon is still in existence. It hasn't been burnt. Uposel machmas dover acher. The reason why it's posel is because it was taken out of the azara. But there's no psul in the guf hakorban. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva says that zrika mo elis. Now let me just double check to see if what I said is correct here. Okay, fine. Oh, excellent. So the zrika mo elis of Rabbi Akiva is to remove me'ila. Wow. In other words, normally we would say that the zrika is matir the basar bachili. You can't, in this case, you can't say that because the karba was taken yotze out of the azor, and therefore it's possible. And therefore, you would say that the normal process or rule that zrika removes, removes me'ila. Why does zrika remove me'ila? Because zrika is matir, right? The zrika is the last of the four avodas, and it's matir the basar, fachilas kohen, or maybe even fachilas adam. I mean, zar non-kohen. So therefore, that removes me'ila because the zrika is matir. But here, the zrika can't be matir because the carbon was taken by chutz. And yet, Rabbi Akiva says the zrika is still meaningful. Why? Says Rav Huna, because Rabbi Akiva puts all the emphasis on be'ene, meaning the carbon is still in existence. Avol chisaron, but in our case, in the boilahu, namely where the shiraim chasru ben kmitza le'aktara, so therefore when he gets the aktara, he's got no. Well, I'm sorry, not no, but he can't be matir the shiraim b'achila because the shiraim are chaser. And Rabbi Akiva agrees that concedes that if the shiraim are chaser, then the haktara of the komets cannot be matir the shiraim. So the shiraim is also. But nevertheless, the Gemara wants to insist that the haktara will be meaningful, even though it's not matir the shiraim lachila, it could have a machsheves pigul generated, and it registers as far as removing the me'ila. No, says Rav Huna, that's impossible. Why? Because the whole sheet of Rabbi Akiva that the zrika could be meaningful after the psul yotze was chal, and there's no matir for the achila, is only because the carbon is still in existence. But if there's a chisar in the gufa carbon, like for example in our case where the shiraim were chaser, the psula de gufe have is lo mahani le'aktara. The aktara cannot be effective. Even Rabbi Akiva, who holds that the zrika is effective after the carbon was taken chutz, would be moda that if there's a chisaron in the shiraim, the aktara could not remove the isa me'ila. Amalei Rova, Adarab. In Yiddish we say Pugfaker. I'm going to tell you that Afilu Rabbi Eliezer Diomer Ein Zrika Mo Elis Liyotze. On the contrary, the situation of Yotze is a lot worse than the situation of Chaser. And Rabbi Eliezer would hold that the Zrika after the Psul Yotze is Chal is meaningless. Why is that so? Hani mili yotze dilesa lifnim. The validity and the efficacy of zrika, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is only bifnim, only on that which is in the azara. That which is taken out of the azara, then the zrika could have no impact on that which is outside of the azara. Aval chisaron de isa bifnim, even if the shiraim are incomplete and part of the shiraim was lost, but at least that which is left, the remnants of the shiraim are in the azara, is mahani le'aktara. Now, even Rabbi Eliezer will agree that aktara is effective for that which was left within the um, the Azara, and even though as a result of the chisarn in the shirayim, there won't be a heter achil of the shirayim, but nevertheless, the Torah will be meaningful to remove the isa me'ilah. How did I draw this conclusion? In other words, Rava is now going to try to prove from our Mishnah that this is the case, and the Haktorah will be matir, or I should say be mafkia me'ilah, even though it cannot be matir the shirayim bachil because they're chas. But the main point is that they're still within the azor. Okay, now Disnan. Hakometzes hamincha lechol shireha bachutz. Okay, so now the Gemara quotes our Mishnah as is, but Rava's proof is built on a different text in the Mishnah, and that's Rabbi Chia's text in the Mishnah. So our text in the Mishnah is Hakometzes hamincha lechol shireha bachutz. So now he has a machshava of chutz limkomo for the kmitza vis-a-vis the shirayim, right? We said that the kmitza, after it culminates in the aktorah of the kometz, is going to be mata the shirayim b'achila, and he had in mind to eat the shirayim b'chutz. That's machshavas chutz. O kizayis mishirei chutz. So now the Mishnah says that even if his machshava of chutz was only on a kizayis of the shirayim, only on a partial amount of the partial segment of the shirayim, that's enough to generate a psul of machshavas chutz limkom. But v'tani Reb Chia, hakometz es hamincha lechol shirayim b'chutz. So lechol shirayim b'chutz means he had in mind that the entire shirayim would be eaten b'chutz. That's a machshava of chutz limkomo haposelis. V'lo tani o kizayis. In Reb Chia's Mishnah, erase the words o kizayis. And that applies to both the Reisha and the Seifa. So consistently in the Mishnah, Reb Chia, for some reason, felt coerced to remove the words o kizayis. My timer asks Rava what motivated Reb Chia to alter the text of our Mishnah, Velotani o kizayis. Why did he leave that out? Comes along Rava, and again, this is all Rava's understanding of Reb Chia's Mishnah. Lav, because, right, that's a rhetorical question. Kigon shechasu shirayim v'kamulei akizayis. Meaning part of the shirayim were lost, which is called chaser. However, what's left of the shirayim that did not get lost was a kizayis worth. The kevan dimimatan kli behiluf ubaktora lo masnile. Okay, for this we'll have to just 1 second. Let me just do something technical. Sorry.